important element of progress.
Acting in secret and without proper accountability, and because they always get things wrong, we can reliably expect that there are going to be more scandals come out of this.
Welcome to Evening Report tonight. We're joined by Paul Buchanan, who is going to talk to us about his analysis and his take on the Nicky-Hager-led investigation into New Zealand's spying operations via the GCSB, which was published in the New Zealand Herald today. In short, it revealed how New Zealand spies on Japan, Vietnam, China, India, Pakistan, South American nations, which is a surprise, and a range of other countries, as the New Zealand Herald wrote today. So reading from that, we'll just go to Paul Buchanan. Paul, what do you make of these latest revelations?
Well, let me first say good evening and congratulations on this venture, Selwyn. It's a very welcome and needed addition to the media landscape in New Zealand. Now, as far as the revelations are concerned, not entirely surprising, but the depth, in terms of the scope, it's not that surprising, although we can get into that a little bit. The depth is interesting because I guess what people need to understand is in the intelligence business, you play offense and defense. And so counterintelligence, where you're spying on spies and whatnot, that's the defensive side. And obviously, in the signals intelligence community, when you're trying to fend off cyber hacking, that's the defensive side. And for us in New Zealand, that was the major justification for the amendments to the GCSB Act last year that expanded the powers of the GCSB. However, you also play offense. And what was very revealing in this particular tranche was that the GCSB installs malware on the communications of foreign diplomats. And that means we're being very offensive, no pun intended, when it comes to the private communications, not only of what you could consider hostile states like North Korea, but to our allies, partners, and friends.
Okay, well, let's just have a really good look at this. For example, if we go to the New Zealand Herald, the main article here, sourced by obviously the Snowden documents, the Snowden revelations. Nicky-Hager is in direct contact with Edward Snowden and obviously with The Intercept. New Zealand Herald, amazing collaboration amongst mainstream media on this one. They've got to be applauded here. To recap on the detail, what we've got is the GCSB, this is written in the Herald this morning, the GCSB provides collection on China, Japan, North Korea, Vietnamese, South American diplomat communications, South Pacific nations, Pakistan, India, Iran, and Antarctica. Now, you know, this whole thing here, Paul, it clearly is an issue of national interest for New Zealand too. And the New Zealand Herald raised that point to a degree and said, you know, that the documents, for example, were obtained by the NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, but highlight discrepancies between secret and official foreign policy adopted by New Zealand. So how do you read that element of the revelations relating to New Zealand's foreign policy? We often used to bask in its independence. What does it mean for New Zealand now, Paul?
Well, it gives the lie to the notion of independence and autonomy in international relations and foreign affairs, and therein lies the rub, because I mean, there's the old saw that when politicians lie when they open their mouths. When diplomats say yes, they mean maybe. When they say maybe, they mean no. So there obviously is a lot of fudging and gray area when it comes to foreign policy pronouncements, but it is very difficult for a country like New Zealand, which has a public platform of being independent and autonomous in international affairs, an honest broker, as they often like to say, a country that campaigned for the UN Security Council temporary seat as a representative of small island nations, as a representative of countries that were 9 to line, to then be found out to not only be spying on ostensible allies and trading partners, but doing so largely at the behest of the United States, the UK, and perhaps Canada and Australia. And I think there will be diplomatic fallout as a result of these revelations, and there are more to come. This isn't the end of it when it comes to the Snowden files on New Zealand. So I fear that there's trouble ahead for New Zealand.
You know, in the past, you've made mention of New Zealand straddling right across from the Eastern Pacific, right across to Southeast Asia, that it's got one leg in the United States' security apparatus, its defence declarations, etc., with New Zealand, the friendlier nation status, becoming an ally, but on trade, its dependency on Southeast Asia, particularly China, but certainly the ASEAN nations. Now, you've said in the past that New Zealand risked tripping itself up. Now, is this the issue that is the tripwire, in your opinion?
Well, this could be the beginning of the end, and you're absolutely right. I have, for quite a while. In fact, I can pinpoint it since the signing of the Wellington and Washington declarations that align New Zealand not only very closely to the United States as a military partner, but made it a first-tier military and security partner of the United States, that given the trade orientation towards Southeast Asia, the PRC in particular, and increasingly Central Asia and the Middle East, that juxtaposition, trading preferentially with the East and China in particular, yet aligning New Zealand even more closely to the United States, was untenable over the long term. If we think of it as straddling the fence, that's a barbed wire fence. And this could be the beginning of losing a toehold over that fence, in the sense that the Chinese probably knew that as a part of Five Eyes, New Zealand was tapping into their communications. But the thing with diplomacy is that people may well know things. It's like the relative you don't want to talk about. You may well know these things, but when they come into the open, you have to respond publicly to them. You know, you can't even to just save face. You can't just let bygones be bygones. And we, as the smallest and most trade-dependent partner of the Five Eyes, are clearly the most vulnerable. So whereas the PRC may not want to retaliate against the Australians because they depend on them for strategic minerals, they may not wish to retaliate against the United States because the United States is a formidable adversary. We're easy to pick on, and one has to wonder why the successive New Zealand governments, but particularly this one, have so slavishly followed the lead of the larger partners, and the United States in particular, when it comes to targeting foreign communications. You know, I would have hoped, but apparently that's too much hope, that New Zealand would pick and choose the targets that it would then not only use for its own national interest, but that it would pass along to the NSA, and apparently that's not the case.
And do you think that this type of unease or displeasure, particularly within the People's Republic of China, is going to spill out into the public arena? Or is it going to be that New Zealand is spoken of like you say, you know, the horrible in-law, or the embarrassing relative, or the embarrassing friend, where you whisper in the shadows but you don't actually say it in public? Are we going to see this in public?
Well, the way things are going, yes, we will. But, you know, let me back up a little bit. When Edward Snowden left Hawaii, he obviously took, you know, hundreds of thousands of files with him. The Americans are saying it's the worst security branch intelligence breach ever in the history of the United States. But that was known to the Americans about a month after he left. They did a forensic audit. They figured out what he took. And, of course, they would then share what they know that Snowden took. So the New Zealand government has known since mid-2013 what Snowden has on New Zealand. And I would have thought the prudent thing to do, knowing that this would eventually come out, is that the New Zealand government would approach those governments, particularly strategically important governments like that of the PRC, and explain to them the circumstances under which this espionage occurred, offer the due apologies, and hopefully keep it all private and as a private conversation between diplomats. But the Prime Minister of New Zealand has repeatedly said that he is not concerned about the revelations. It's old news. Who cares? It's nothing but conspiracy theorists and what have you. And that indicates to me that either he's completely out of the loop, or there is no contingency planning. They've done nothing in order to forestall a public backlash against them by these targets of espionage. And if that's the case, again, we're in serious trouble. Now, if he's obfuscating and blustering while the diplomats quietly talk to not only the Chinese, mind you, I mean these South American countries will not be happy to know that they're being spied on. Trading partners like Iran, as much as the United States has a beef with Iran, the last I've read, New Zealand has good diplomatic relations with the Republic of Iran. So, I believe that if they have not been proactive and gotten out in front of this as soon as they found out what Snowden had on New Zealand, then yes, this is going to become public, and once it becomes public, it becomes uncontrollable on the part of the New Zealand government. The cat is out of the bag at that point, and then it's all about damage control.
So we're back live again now, Paul, and what we were talking about was the diplomatic fallout, and I was just pointing out some of the reflective backgrounds, if you like. New Zealand positioning itself through the last 2 decades in a big way as a trade-led economy, a trade-led diplomatic mission. Yeah, welcome back. The GCSB must have severed our cable, Paul, or something like that. We certainly lost you in a big way, but we've got you back now, which is the most important thing. And we'll patch this up so that when the video on demand is available for people once this concludes, it'll knit together and people won't even know in a week's time. So we're back live again now, Paul, and what we were talking about was the diplomatic fallout. And I was just pointing out some of the some of those technical issues, Paul. So there we go. These things certainly take you by surprise. But yeah, so the New Zealand with a trade-led diplomatic mission, the impact this type of revelation has on that trade-led diplomatic mission, it must be really doing its crunching the hours at night. Also, what's been revealed here in the New Zealand Herald with the Edward Snowden revelations, Nicky-Hager investigation, and others, clearly is that New Zealand is not a 2-bit player in this chain of Five Eyes nations. We always seem to feel that New Zealand was a very small pinky in the Anglo-Saxon iron fist, but this type of thing shows that for whatever reason, and you may have an indication of what that reason is, New Zealand is actually being pushed out to the front lines of intelligence here and risking a lot with our trading partners by putting the spy surveillance frame right on them.
Well, political scientists often say that the shadow of the future weighs heavily on present decision-making. But in this instance, the shadow of the past influences our decision-making. The Five Eyes network is a post-World War II Cold War creation. And there are levels of trust between these Anglophone countries that they don't share with anyone else. However, in doing so, two things have mitigated very, very heavily in New Zealand's approach to this. One is that they never thought they would be found out. There was inconceivable to anybody in the network that someone like Edward Snowden would emerge and take the quantity of documents that he did. And, we could run a whole sidebar about the privatization of intelligence because Snowden was a contractor, not a U.S. government employee. His security vetting, as it turns out, was a little suspect, but that was done by a private firm, not the U.S. government itself. But that's a sidebar. They simply didn't think they would ever be caught. Now, the second thing, though, the second thing is this. The technology today is far more intrusive than any of the technologies prior to the cyber age. It's one thing to intercept signals. You know, you've got to position yourself to intercept the satellites themselves and the beam from the satellite to the host country. But in this day and age, the cyber age, you can engage in mass bulk collection that's undifferentiated and then data mine it afterwards. That simply could not occur 25 years ago. So the combination of being found out that there are individuals, whistleblowers, who simply do not like what they're seeing, and the technologies that make those whistleblowers so concerned have combined to reveal New Zealand's role. I'll tell you what, if those two things had not come together, we'd still be in the dark as to New Zealand's role, and you're absolutely right. We're a little more than the pinky on the iron fist of the Five Eyes.
And this outsourcing aspect, I mean, as I understand it, Paul, you yourself were involved with a company that contracted to the United States security intelligence apparatus, and this was some time ago. Do you see any indication from the United States that they have found a real problem, a real security breach problem by outsourcing such sensitive type of tasks and operations to the private sector?
Yes, they have. And Snowden, of course, is the worst and most egregious case. But there has been numerous cases now of private contractors using their security clearances to spy on their ex-wives and, you know, that sort of, you know, personal failure. The difference is simply this. You know, when I got my very high clearances in the mid-90s, the U.S. government vetted me, and they went back to my teenage years. I took, you know, multiple polygraph tests. They talked to my ex-wife. She had nothing good to say about me. You know, they really were thorough, and then they told me, once I got into a position of trust, that the computers I was using, and this was in the floppy disk age, were subject 24/7, 365 to unannounced audits. And if they found anything missing from the central files that was classified, that I would immediately lose my clearance and I would be charged with a federal crime, that is unauthorized removal of classified material. After 9/11, the push was so hard to get analysts, to get everybody involved, and of course the market orientation drove profit-oriented actors to enter into this particular breach. They began getting looser and looser with regards to issuing security clearances. They did not vet people anywhere as they did me back in the days when the government did it itself. And the contradiction is this: you can't have a government that, because the market directives, wants to privatize everything and still remain as secure as if the government was doing the clearances themselves. And Snowden was clearly an example of that. He had, when he was in Geneva, he was complaining in chat rooms about the onerous nature of his job as a CIA technician. That should have been picked up right there. And the fact that it wasn't, and then he was offered successive jobs that were of even more critical importance, indicates that, you know, someone dropped the ball when it came to, you know, if not giving him the clearance in the first place, then certainly auditing him as he progressed through his career. But be that as it may, the issue is simply this: for better or worse, you know, this is out in the open now. And I would have thought that policymakers in New Zealand, you know, knowing that this was now in the open, regardless of who was to blame and whatnot, would have adopted contingency measures in order to mitigate the adverse consequences of the news getting out that New Zealand is a central player in the Five Eyes and it spies on friend and foe alike. And if we have not done that, then the government is clearly remiss in that regard, because I believe that the consequences have yet to come, and they will be significant.
Okay, well, let's look at the Prime Minister's role here. You mentioned before that we raised the possibility, well, Nicky-Hager expanded on the probability, in his view, that the Prime Minister, John Key, knows very little of what really goes on at the GCSB, that the GCSB, in Nicky-Hager's view, is operating as a New Zealand base on, a United States base on New Zealand soil. Now, if we look at the Prime Minister has insisted that many of the documents are out of date, like you said in the part one of this interview. But the New Zealand Herald investigation today revealed that in April 2013, that's when these major documents that it published and cited today were actually completed. That an officer from the NSA in the United States completed this top secret review outlining what the GCSB contributes to within the US-led alliance. So that seems to put the Prime Minister's argument, remember, April 2013, it seems to put the Prime Minister's argument to bed that these revelations are out of date. Do you see it in those terms as well?
Well, yes, I do. I think that Nicky-Hager is a very polite man, and so he simply has pointed out that the documents were current up through April of 2013, which is politically close enough in my regard, in my view. There are two ways that ministers of intelligence, ministers in general, act towards their portfolios. You can be hands-on or hands-off. The hands-on approach means that you micromanage, you get involved, and sometimes you get involved too much. And that was an accusation made against Helen Clark. On the other hand, you can be hands-off. That's the Ronald Reagan approach, is that plausible deniability. I didn't know what was going on right under my nose. And John Key has taken a page out of that book, and then he's refined that page because he doesn't remember, he wasn't told. You know, it's all the fault of his underlings, even though he's the minister in charge. And so now he's saying that the documents are old. I think Mr. Hager was right. He wouldn't even know if the documents were old or not if he completely depends on his underlings and doesn't ask them hard questions. You know, what are you guys doing? Couldn't it be a problem if we're spying on the Chinese and they're our biggest trading partner? And if so, how are we going to sort this out if it comes out into the public domain? And so I think here you see the Achilles heel of the plausible deniability, hands-off approach to ministerial responsibility. If you're caught out in a big way, and you're either one of two things. You're either incompetent or you're a liar, because there's no way that a minister in such a sensitive area, a core area of state activity, could possibly be so ignorant of the activities of the agency that he's ostensibly in charge of. So I'm forced to agree with Mr. Hager on this. Mr. Key doesn't know what's going on underneath his nose, and he may think that's a virtue. I think that's a vice.
Of course, what is going on is the surveillance of French Polynesia, that's Tahiti, also up New Caledonia, the shipping lanes of the South and West Pacific. Also, it sounds like, Paul, that Chile and Argentina potentially are our surveillance targets as well, from the GCSB base in the South Island of New Zealand. What effect do you believe this revelation is going to have on South American countries, Latin American countries? And just so the audience knows, Paul Buchanan grew up most of his early part of his life in the Latin American part of the American continent.
Well, let me. There's a lot in that question, so let me start with the Latin Americans and back up to the French. Let me just give you a clear example of what might happen, hypothetically speaking, if it turns out that we are indeed spying on Argentina, the way we spied on Argentina during the Falklands War at the behest of the British. If it turns out we're spying on the Argentines, and we're doing so not only for military and diplomatic reasons, but we're doing so for economic reasons, one of the possible retaliations could be the following. Within the last 6 months, Air New Zealand has signed a contract to fly 3 or 4 times a week to Buenos Aires direct. After Qantas got out of the business, after LAN got out of the business, after Aerolíneas Argentinas got out of the business, Air New Zealand took its time, but has just signed this mega deal to open Argentina and the eastern seaboard of Latin America via direct flights by Air New Zealand. It is very possible the Argentines will cancel that deal as a result of revelations that we're spying on them for economic reasons. And that's why I've tried to say over the past few months that the range of retaliation is incredibly broad, and we are incredibly vulnerable. And so even a country like Argentina can hurt us, and hurt us badly, if it turns out that we were spying on them for what they will consider is no good reason. Now, with regards to the French, spying on French territory without their permission is a serious offense. Now, we know that France is a third-tier partner of the Five Eyes. The first partner is the U.S., the second-tier partners are the other four, and then countries like Singapore, countries like India, who we're also spying on, and France share information with us. The French Pacific Fleet is based in Tahiti. The French Pacific Army, a division-strength army, is based in New Caledonia. And it turns out we are spying on those French territories as well as Vanuatu. If the French haven't given us permission to do so under an intelligence sharing arrangement, that has the makings of a diplomatic problem. Now, I know that the French have a listening post of their own in Noumea in New Caledonia. What they want to listen to is up to conjecture, but one would imagine it was maritime traffic and communications, because a number of countries run submarines as well as surface vessels, and those countries are both friendly and not so friendly. But if we are not asking the French permission, or if we don't have a contractual relationship with them, whereby they share intel with us and we share intel with them, then I would imagine that the New Zealand ambassador to Paris will be called in by the foreign ministry for a please explain meeting. And that gets to the heart of the issue of the sea lines of communication. If you think that Asian, Latin American trade has increased exponentially over the last 10 years, exponentially because Latin America has raw materials and resources that Asians want, the PRC in particular, those sea lanes are becoming of increasing strategic importance to competitors of the Chinese and other Asian countries. Those competitors are by and large located in the West, and so anything that could give them a leg up on how the Chinese do business, their vessel movements, anything of the sort, would be of strategic advantage to the Five Eyes, and in the measure that that's discovered, that will cause, again, diplomatic problems with the countries involved.
And also as a retake too, for those who think that there's nothing new to this type of information, that we've talked about and we've suspected that New Zealand has taken place in the Five Eyes Alliance for some time, that it's been welcomed back into the club, that this is not news. The big issues here are New Zealand's capability via, well, the United States' capability via the GCSB base in New Zealand soil, but extra-regional territory type of operation. So it's not just this Pacific patch, but we're able to target via that technologies Afghanistan communications, Iran, as Paul has pointed out, places well outside our particular patch. Let's talk about solutions, Paul. If you've identified real problems there and have identified real problems relating to New Zealand's national interest, what are the solutions there? Is it that if New Zealand had adequate oversight of our intelligence agencies, would that go some way to protecting New Zealand's national interest in the future?
Yes, I believe so. Resting on legality is not enough. You know, we've heard today the acting director of the GCSB saying, well, everything we do is legal. In fact, we've heard that particular justification time and time again. Well, just because it's legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's right. And again, you know, spying on opponents, foes of the alliance, not just New Zealand, can be justified on national security grounds. But once you get into spying on trading partners, you're really starting to stretch the concept of national security. And your remarks about oversight are absolutely right. It is the natural tendency of intelligence agencies, not just the signals intelligence agencies, but with the human intelligence agencies, to do whatever is permissible given the law, whether or not it's right. You will do as much as you can, push the envelope as much as you can, because you're within the legal parameters and sometimes within the gray area between legal and illegal activities. Absent any effective oversight, independent of the executive branch, because after all, the executive branch are the people who set the policy under which intelligence agencies operate, then they pretty much can do as they please. And so the key to reining in this ambition, this urge to do everything possible within the limits of the law is to have independent, effective oversight as a third-party overseer, if you will, because the judiciary will rule on the legalities, which again is simply not enough. The executive gives the policy under which these agencies operate, so they're calling the shots. So you require an independent oversight capability, which at any point in time under powers of oath, with dedicated professionals working for it, can call in these agencies and say, hold on a second, you're spying on our biggest trading partner at the behest of one of our security partners. Could you not tell the security partner that they need to do that themselves, because the consequences of us being found out are too onerous for us to handle, to abide by? And the partners may not like it, but we're locked in. They can't get rid of us, and we can't easily relinquish our role in the Five Eyes. The key to getting independence back in the intelligence community in New Zealand is independent oversight, and that can only come from Parliament. A dedicated intelligence oversight committee in Parliament that, unlike the toothless wonder that now passes for an intelligence and security committee, is a dedicated agency of Parliament with its own staff, its own funding, and is nonpartisan in nature, and they can ask the hard questions under oath at any time of day, given any particular subject. If that occurs, I would be willing to bet that the blanket passing of information onto the Five Eyes partners and the spying on people that we have no quarrel with will end.
And do you believe, in closing, Paul, do you believe that it is because of New Zealand's lack of independent oversight or legislative oversight that that is the reason why New Zealand is being, let's say, exploited by the superpowers in this task?
I think that's a very good point, Selwyn. I think that they realize that unlike themselves, the government of New Zealand has a lot of room for maneuver that they do not themselves have. And so they task us with particularly marginal or difficult espionage tasks that they cannot do themselves. It's not just about filling the gaps. It's about doing the things that they legally cannot do, or they cannot do because of the weight of public scrutiny. We have very little, I'm almost tempted to say no effective oversight of intelligence activities in this country. And not only is that onerous from a democratic principle, but it certainly can lead us into the situation we are today, where we could be discovered to be doing things at behest of larger partners that have nothing to do with our own national interest. And let's be very clear on this. For all of these revelations today about who we spy on foreignly, the justifications for the expansion of the intelligence apparatus in New Zealand have rested on one thing: preventing terrorism, and two things: preventing terrorism and preventing foreign cyber hacking. Yet, in the last few days, we find out that there has been a domestic threat to the major parts of the economy of New Zealand, domestically driven, that has nothing to do with Islamic terrorism, and which no expanded powers of state surveillance, seizure, and control could prevent. So I think we need to be aware that perhaps the intelligence community is spending too much time looking away from the real threats to the country because it's having to play the role, I don't want to use that term club, but it's having to be a team player in a club whose interests are not coincident and necessarily those of New Zealand.
Well, thanks very much, Paul, and thank you to the audience for chipping in here and joining us on Evening Report. And apologies for the technical problems earlier on. Obviously, we'll get better at those kind of things, and the video on demand will be on site from now on as soon as we push the stop button, and it will be spliced together for tomorrow viewing on the site too. So thanks again, Paul, and we'll see you again, no doubt, on this particular issue at some stage in the future.
My pleasure, thanks.